everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about seeds to start in February, and some of these seeds I've already started, some I'm going to start today, and some will be for later in the month. And of course this timeline and info is going to be based off of our estimated last frost date, which is April 14th. If yours is earlier or later, you should adjust this accordingly. But for us at the moment, we are kind of at about 9 to 10 weeks before our estimated last frost date. It is early to mid-February right now, and I'm still just starting seeds that are like spring crops that are cold hardy. So yeah, anyway, I'm gonna kind of like go through the month and talk about the things that I would start in early February, moving on to mid-February, and then late February at the end, of course. This list is just going to be things that I like to start around this time. It might not be a comprehensive list of everything you can start, but I do think we're going to cover a lot of like different families of plants just to give you an idea of things that are good to start around this time. So anyway, I'm going to jump into the seeds that I've already started because these are like early February seeds. I started these last week, and I'm going to show you how those seeds are doing at the end of this video, as well as an update of all of my other seedlings. So stay tuned to the end for that. But the first category of seeds that I would start in early February are cauliflowers and cabbages, possibly broccoli if you have a broccoli that does have longer days to maturity. But the range for these kinds of plants is anywhere from 65 to 85 days to maturity. So for example, I have a white cauliflower called Bishop cauliflower. You can see that this one is 65 days to maturity, which is a little bit on the lower end compared to this red cabbage that is 85 days to maturity. So within this family, just kind of look at that range to get an idea of what things you should start earlier. And then this is another cabbage that I started. So cauliflowers and cabbages. And again, like I said, you can kind of start getting into broccolis around like early to mid-February. I used to start my broccoli around the same time as my cauliflower and cabbage, but I did realize that my broccoli grows a lot faster than the other plants. So this year I decided to push that out a week or two just because they don't take as long to grow. So even though like I kind of group them in the same category, I've realized that it is really important to look at the days to maturity because depending on the variety, some plants can be quite a lot faster. For example, I have this green magic broccoli, which I am going to be starting today, and this one is only 55 days to maturity. So compared to the 85 days to maturity of the red cabbage I showed you, that's almost a month of time difference. So those are definitely on the quicker end. It could be because they're a hybrid broccoli. I'm not really sure how many days heirloom broccolis take. But yeah, I think that's going to be like the first category of things that you can start in early to mid-February. Now we're like solidly in mid-February, and I'm going to go over a few more things that I'm also going to be starting today, as well as over the course of the next week. And this is going to encompass a lot of different types of leafy greens. So for example, I have this bok choy. I'm going to be starting probably a lot of this today. Then you also have kale. This is one of my favorite varieties called Dazzling Blue, so I'll definitely be starting more of this. And then of course a big category would be lettuces, and I have a lot of varieties of lettuce, but I think they pretty much all will take about the same amount of time. So I just picked out a few varieties here today to show you, and I'll probably choose one or two that I'm going to start today. Oh yeah, and then one thing that I'm not going to be planting, but I just brought out as another example of a leafy green. If you like Swiss chard, you can also pretty much categorize that with all of the other leafy greens. And for all of these leafy greens, I would say that they take between 40 to 50 days to maturity, but it is pretty flexible for these types of greens because you can pick them pretty young. So maybe even as early as 30 days, you can start picking baby greens. And it's not something like cauliflower or broccoli where you're waiting for that like one head to form. The leafy greens you can kind of just harvest as they grow. So all of the things that I've mentioned up to now, they are all cold hardy plants. So my plan for all of these things, whether I started them last week or if I'm going to start them next week, the plan in my head is to plant them out around late March, maybe early April, depending on how the weather's looking. So around late March, I'll look at the weather, and if it does seem like it's like starting to warm up a good amount, and if it has been a little bit on the warmer side, then I will start hardening off my plants and transplanting them out a couple of weeks ahead of our estimated last frost date. And by warm, I mean It can dip below freezing, but maybe not by a lot. So if it's maybe like 25 Fahrenheit and above, as long as my seedlings are hardened off, I would feel ready starting to transplant them into the garden. That way they get a few weeks in the garden before our estimated last frost date to have that extra time growing before it really starts to heat up for the spring and summer, because these plants don't like warmer weather. So I like to get them out pretty early so that they don't bolt during the heat of the season when it starts getting really hot. So if I plant these seeds now, they'll have 4 to 6 weeks of growing indoors before I start to transplant them out, which I think is a pretty good amount of time for them to grow inside. And then one more thing that I am going to be starting today is I'm going to start my sweet potato slips. It's a really easy process. I just take a couple of sweet potatoes from my crop last year and I put them in some soil, and then eventually they're going to grow some leaves. I'll take those leaves off and put them in water, and I'll show you that whole process as it happens throughout the season. But around this time is when I like to at least get those sweet potatoes in some soil, because that's going to trigger them to form roots and start sprouting, and that process can take a little bit. So I like to do that now. Sweet potatoes are a very warm weather crop. They definitely do not go out until probably May or June for us. So this is something I do well in advance, but now is a good time to do that since it can take a while. And then the last category of seeds that I would start in February, and this is definitely more towards late February for me, that would be peppers and eggplant. I'm not going to show you any varieties today because that's going to be probably a whole video on its own of like all the different peppers and eggplants I'm going to grow, since I do tend to grow a lot of types of peppers. But yeah, just have that on your radar. Around late February, that's a good time to grow those. So I think that's all of the different types of plants and seeds that I want to talk about that I would start in February based on our estimated last frost date of April 14th. So today I'm going to do a little bit more seed starting. I'm going to be planting up, I think, broccoli, bok choy, kale, and lettuce. So a pretty big group of things, basically everything I talked about that's in like the mid-February category. I think I'm going to start those today. Then after I've started all those seeds, I'm going to also just give you a little update on the seedlings that I have going on right now. All of my onion seedlings, as well as any brassicas that I started last week. We're starting to have some really nice, beautiful spring days around here, so I was able to do all of this planting outside today. Today I'm using a 72 cell seed tray for the bulk of the seeds that I'm starting. I do think that this size tray with these cells is really good if I'm trying to start a lot of plants that are kind of on the smaller side and things that are not going to stay inside for too long. Like I said, these plants are going to probably stay inside for 5 to 6 weeks, so they're going to be kind of still on the smaller seedling size, and they're not going to get very large. So this size cell I think is really good, and I'm going to be using this for my bok choy, kale, and lettuce. Most of the tray is going to be for bok choy since that's what I want most of. I'm just doing 6 kale plants, and then whatever's left in the tray I'm splitting between 2 different kinds of lettuce varieties. I'm just going in with a few seeds per tray. I like to go a little bit heavier on the lettuce because I don't mind if those are a little bit more crowded when I plant them out. Before kale and bok choy, I'm aiming for 2 to 3 seeds, and I'll just thin those down to 1 plant per cell later on. Then for my broccoli seedlings, I'm using some 4-cell seed packs just because these will probably be a little bit bigger, and I'm just going to be doing 12 plants of these. And by the way, I'm just using regular potting soil here and just lightly packing it into each of the trays. Oh, and I just wanted to show you in my seed pack, they actually had a little tag that had the variety name on it, which was kind of a nice touch. It would be cool if all seed packets had that, so that was a nice surprise. I had already written my tags, but I'll just save that for next time, but that was fun to see. And for these broccoli seeds, I'm doing 2 to 3 seeds per cell as well, and then I'm going to thin that down to 1 seedling per cell once everything has come up and grown for a little bit. Alright, so now that all of my new seeds are planted, I just added them to this tray in the back. Those are my broccoli ones. In this shelf I have all of the other greens that I started. But you can see I have some seedlings from last month and last week. So let's see how they're doing. All of these like grassy looking seedlings, these are all of my onions. You can see that they're growing really nicely. Got a nice thick bunch of onions in these containers. My lemongrass has also sprouted. Here in the back, you can see my little Greek oregano seedlings. They're really tiny right now. And then the only thing that I didn't really have good germination with is this Zabroon shallot. I only had like a dozen or so seeds in the packet anyway, but I think they were entering their 3rd year. So this is what I mean when I say that onion seeds lose their germination really quickly. I only had 2 or 3 seeds that sprouted out of those dozen. So yeah, the older your onion seeds get, the lower the germination rate will be. But for the seeds that were fresh, like this one, you can see that I had pretty good germination on that. So yeah, those are the onions, and then I have a few brassicas that I started last week, and those are already up. I have a cauliflower here. This one is actually a Chinese cabbage, which those are closer to like 55 days to maturity. I didn't realize they were a little faster, but anyway, that's what those are. And then I did also plant some cabbage back here, but the seeds are a little older, so I think they're taking a little longer to germinate, so those are not up yet. But yeah, that's a little update on how things are going at the seed starting station right now. You can see I have them under grow lights, and yeah, I'll keep you updated as everything grows. So the last thing I wanted to get done for the day was starting my sweet potato slips, and I've brought out a few sweet potatoes just to show you what I look for when I'm choosing the sweet potatoes that I'm going to be using. So first off, I look at the ends of the potatoes. That's usually where you'll see if they're starting to sprout at all. So on this potato, you can see on this one end, there's kind of like a pinkish little like bud, and this is where the sweet potato would start growing some slips. So I chose that sweet potato because I saw it was already starting to do that. If I don't have any sweet potatoes that are starting to do that, I just like to choose some of the smaller ones just because they're easy to submerge in some soil. And if I ever have ones that kind of have like a longer tail, which you probably wouldn't get at like a supermarket, but since we grew these ourselves, sometimes they have a little bit of that tail left over. This is usually where I see that they will start to sprout rather than like from the middle of the potato. It's usually on these like skinnier ends where they'll start to grow. And then here's another example. This is a larger sweet potato. I did see that there were quite a few like little pink sprouts coming from one end, but since this potato is a little bit larger, I didn't want to use the whole thing. I think I'm just gonna cut off the end of this one and stick it in the soil, and I'm pretty sure that will be fine, and it'll grow some slips just from the end of that sweet potato. Even if you don't see any sprouts though, don't really be too concerned as long as you like put it in some soil, or some people like to do this in water actually, but I usually do soil. But as long as you put it in some soil, after a little bit, it's gonna start growing roots and slips, even if you don't see any visible sprouting. So for this, I usually just take any kind of like container that I'm wanting to upcycle. It's usually like a mushroom container. There's no holes on the bottom, and I put some potting soil in there, just filled it up about halfway, and now I'm going to nestle my sweet potatoes into the soil, making sure that it has really nice contact on the bottom side. It doesn't really have to be buried, it just has to have contact with damp soil. And I'm just gonna make sure that I keep the soil consistently moist. I don't want it to be really sopping wet, but having it moist is what's going to trigger the sweet potatoes to start developing roots. And then for the last sweet potato, I'm just cutting off the tip like I said, and I'm just going to nestle that into the soil as well. So I'm just going to add just a tiny bit of water since my soil was a little bit on the dry side. And then after this, I'm just going to leave this on a sunny windowsill. And then after a few weeks, we should start seeing some slips forming. So that is everything that I started today, and all of the things that I think are good to start in February. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you again in the next one.